the piece together with our American videos.
Good. Okay, sorry about this. Ready to go, I think. So thank you very much, first of all, Per, for organising this extremely enjoyable occasion and giving me the chance to come and talk to you. Just referring to the welcome we received, I wanted to mention that I'm going to focus almost entirely on sound per se, but the comments that were made about synesthesia and about interactions between media will raise their heads a few times. We did develop the concept of algorithmic synesthesia 7 years ago, and we've made pieces specifically following that line of thought, that by using algorithmic devices you might be able to enhance synesthesia. But I really was not going to address that in any detail today. Do you want me to put this on?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, okay. But I thought it was worth mentioning at the outset. I also just wanted to mention that you don't have any pointer, do you? No. I also just wanted to mention that I'm going to talk about creative work which is done with my ensemble Australysis, mainly with Hazel Smith, the writer, who's also my partner, Greg White, a computer musician, and other rather good musicians in Australysis, and other creative artists as well, visual artists, video artists that we collaborate with. Then in the kind of cognitive statistical stuff I want to talk about, I did want to acknowledge my statistical expert, who was initially my advisor but became my collaborator, William Dunsmuir, and the interesting collaboration I have at Queen Mary in London with Geraint Wiggins and Marcus Pearce that some of you would know, I'm sure. These are the kind of topics I thought were interesting, hopefully interesting to address. I thought it might be worth just explaining my general strategy about trying to relate what I don't see as two sides, but they are distinct, my creative work from my creative work in research, and how I actively try to bring them together in a way which I find very useful, but which I think is also an important model that a department like ADM or the creative arts faculties of universities in general might find useful to adopt. And we've written a book to try and proselytize a bit about it. I want to have a brief second section about our cognitive work, but I'm not going to bore you with technical analysis or any depth on that. I just wanted to give some tasters, if you like, some feelers. I'm very welcome to take questions in any depth on that, if you like. And as you can see, the majority of the talk is going to be about interactive sound. And what I hope would be useful would be to talk about some of the different ways one can conceptualize interactive sound and therefore develop tools for it and works within it. And so all those 7 or 8 topics are going to be about that. I'm going to address them in different levels, different degrees. I shall say very little, for example, about sonification and cognitive models beyond the idea of how they might be used. And as we go along, I thought I'd try and keep it at least reasonably low-key and entertaining by having several examples from our work and from also the literature of people that I think are very interesting. A few quite ancient examples from 15, 20 years ago, from our work and from Chris Yavolo and from Jeff Pressing. A classic from Shah Davis, which is covered in Steve Dixon's book very nicely. A few examples gradually coming more recently from our work in Australysis. And I'll just show you little snippets or even just single images, depending on time, to give you a taste for them. And I'm going to just start with one as a matter of interest because throughout the rest of the talk, after this slide really, I'm going to be mainly, one exception, I'm going to be mainly focused on sound sculpting and viewing sound as a source which one doesn't necessarily need to formalize in any of the conventional ways which form, for example, pedagogies. And I've been talking at some length with Eddie about pedagogies and how we might relate them to music making across cultures regardless of conceptual core. And so when you have a conceptual core which is based on a tuning system like this score, which is obviously notated with reference to Western equal tempered music, you still have plenty of opportunities for interactivity and novelty in the computer music arena. And this is rather an interesting and challenging piece that Greg White, our member, produced 15, 17 years ago, using Max and using some other software which he'd specially written for the purpose. Remember, Max became really available in the early 90s. And we used this to develop a real-time score. Many of the efforts at EarCam, of course, have taken this far, far further. But we used this to develop a real-time score, which then had to be immediately realized by performers. And I'll show you another example later on where there was a feedback between what was generated and what was performed, in the sense of an analysis of the similarity between what was notated and what was performed, and then it feeding back into what would be generated next. So that's just one of these examples of counter melodies that I'm going to keep coming up with as we go along. Now to come to that first theme of mine, the idea of how to structure a relationship between research, which is going to result in academic publications in international journals. Journals are the only thing that count in Australia, actually. Books, no thanks. Not in research at our kind of field, in cognitive science. Conferences, no, thank you. Journals, please. So this is how to relate, from my point of view, those kind of outputs with creative outputs, while at the same time trying to avoid demeaning the creative outputs, which is unfortunately what's happened, historically speaking, in both Australia and Britain, I think. So this is an example where my main cognitive thrust, which I'll illustrate in a second, is about how do people continuously respond to sound works in particular, and we've done a certain amount with text works as well. So we do experience them temporally. They are essentially temporal activities. So you have to ask, is it at all meaningful, or is it sufficiently meaningful to have somebody exposed to some trivial little chunk of a piece of music and then ask them for a one-word or a one-scale response? And my answer to that is, when you're doing an extremely reductive experiment about what features distinguish A and B, yes. When you're doing something which is addressed to what might be the impact of this music or this temporal stream of audio-visual stuff, my answer is definitely no. That's not going to be enough. We want to know how people feel as they go along, what they think about it, whether they perceive any of the structure, those kind of things. So my cognitive research is almost entirely based on those kind of real-time continuous responses, which brings a certain technical demand in how you analyze it. We do other kinds of experiments, like experiments on retrospection, which are of that type I kind of caricatured first. So we use this special technique, which I will avoid going into, about time series analysis, which is suitable for measures which have continuous multiple points at regular or irregular time spaces. And we use that in order to do things like take symbolic properties of music, let's say the notation of it, or properties which are continuous variables within music, let's say music's acoustic intensity, to relate them to perceptual responses. Sometimes we relate them specifically to the issue of loudness, sometimes to affective responses, like, did you perceive this to be an expression of arousal or soporificness? Did you perceive it to be an expression of something likable or something dislikable, unlikable? And so we use continuous measures of those kinds of things, which surprisingly enough people do perform with coherence in order to analyze those kind of relationships. Then, coming down to the bottom but one arrow, we in some cases have been able to go back to a more traditional kind of scientific experiment and say, well, this is all very well and good, but it's just a correlation. I'd like to know about causality, real definitive impact in the traditional scientific reductive sense. And then we do a study where we intervene and we transform something and we see whether the transformation produces the predicted change. And then finally, we come to the interesting bit really for today's purpose. The information, the concepts, the processes, even the time series models gleaned in that process, I then use in creative work generation. And it in turn provides stimuli for these experiments, provides new ideas for them, and I try to go out of my way a bit to document that cycle as a useful thing. We put quite a strong argument about that cycle being an important way of looking at what was traditionally called practice-based or practice-led research, and that we should think of it also as having the potential to be research-led. And computer music, of course, is probably the place in music in which this is most powerful and most possible, most useful. So just let me play you a little bit of this piece as another example of the kind of things we do, real-time stuff. This is it's one of the relatively few audio-visual works I'm going to show you, which is done by us in collaboration with a beautiful American video artist, Will Lewis, and it's I'll just show you a little chunk of it. So I won't let Sandy Evans, the saxophonist, get going. I'll just explain briefly what's entailed in this. As you can see, there are two separate video processes going on. In the center of the thing is a composed video that Will Lewis made for us, which actually has a palindromic structure. We won't see that. In the outer part is transformation of that, which is real-time jitter live manipulation, which I do. And then the music is real-time live interactive stuff, both the acoustic saxophone, saxophone processing, and piano, and you didn't hear any piano, but there is some piano and computer processing at my end of the ensemble. So that's enough of that one. So moving on to the next aspect of the talk. In this chunk, I just want to talk briefly about the kinds of studies we do on affect. So this is asking the question, essentially, when you're listening to this piece of music, which you're going to sit hearing with headphones, Mr. Participant or Madam Participant, I want you to respond continuously about various properties of it. And what we're trying to understand is issues about the kinds of expectation that people build up as pieces progress. Those expectations might be, as discussed originally by Leonard Meyer, ones to do with knowledge of the schema of, say, Western music, or they may be, in the case of the kind of music that a lot of us here make, expectations which are much more immediately driven by the context which has just passed, by the building structure of the current piece. And we would like to distinguish those two kinds of things, if you like, a long-term knowledge of music, which everybody has in different ways and different degrees, and the short-term information of the current piece. And we're very much influenced by both Meyer and also David Huron, who, if you're interested in reading a book about music cognition, I would recommend his book Sweet Anticipation, I think ahead of anything else, by a long chalk at the moment. And he elaborates a theory about how expectation may contribute to generation of tension. And one thing that we always come back to and have to keep bearing in mind is that one cannot afford to think that a musical structure which the composer knows they have built in is necessarily one which is perceived as an entity. And therefore, unless it is, of course, it's unlikely to be a key influence upon people's, if you like, consequent perception of affect. So we just keep that in mind all the time, and we do stuff about perception of structure sometimes to try to do it. We have a direct measure of people's perception of structure in a very simple sense, which doesn't entail telling them what structure is. And in that, we ask them to demonstrate their perception of change. I'll show you just in a minute the kind of interface we do. And it is well known that structure doesn't necessarily map closely onto perception. It's also known that perception of things like acoustic intensity is influenced downwards, if you like, by the mind. The reality of how an intensity profile changes with time is not necessarily the way it's exactly perceived. And one of the possible arguments for that is this is because we want to make it maximally useful from a biological perspective. So a sound which seems to be getting louder and might be approaching us is potentially requiring more attention than one which is receding. It's also worth mentioning, and I take this as a bonus, that when you study electroacoustic music in these kind of cognitive contexts, you're dealing with music which is pretty unfamiliar to people. And so the question of the influence of the long-term schema versus the short-term current music is biased towards the short term, and that's our purpose in making this emphasis on electroacoustic music. So you can see with reference to Trevor Wishart's Redbird, Xenakis Bohor, Webern piano variations, a noise piece of my own. Hardly anybody has heard much music like this. A couple of gurus have heard the Wishart. One people had even heard my piece, but that's obviously because they were Australian. But generally, they're very unfamiliar. So that's a tick as far as I'm concerned. If the web will work, I'll just show you this. This is now another counter melody. This is going back to 1996, and a piece that we did whose purpose was to get multiplicity of interaction available across the web. And if you remember that Mosaic was released in 1994, this is fairly early on. And this was a response to a commission call from the Australian Film Commission, who said, we would like some artists to make multimedia works for the web which can fit into a floppy disk of 1 megabyte. So this is real history. And I thought, how are we going to get multiplicity of sound in 1 megabyte? And of course, the only solution you can really realistically come up with is either real-time transformation of very small sound objects or MIDI. So we came up with MIDI, and we have, let me just see if it'll go quickly enough for you to get the feel for it, because it is mildly fun. Oh, sorry, wrong one. I need Safari. It has on the opening screen, it still works, believe it or not. This is direct from the ABC website. Where's the sound? Yep. It has audio immediately going as soon as you open up the page and before you start going. It's a classic hypertext style. And the one interesting thing that we achieved was getting QuickTime to go in reverse. I actually had to have communication with the person at Apple who's called the QuickTime music architect then. I said, can you please make the QuickTime panel do palindromes, go in reverse? And so he did. And furthermore, it also works in reverse. It did work in reverse for audio files, and we have that on another piece from this period. Whereas now you try and do that in the audio tag in HTML5, it's much more of a pain, I can assure you. We've lost some of these things, and doing MIDI in HTML5 is also... Now what we were able to achieve was, where are we? Yeah. The plugin is not missing. We were able to achieve the addition of a there we go. This is what I was trying to show first of all. We were able to achieve multiplicity, so you can have actually 5 different things going, and the screen where the Java balked at going allows you to do interactive dragging around of words, and they each produce, there are 4 or 5 different sounds. I won't waste time on making it work because it's obviously a trivial thing. And then the general body of the text is hypertext like this with lots of interesting issues, and we have both text, and eventually we have somewhere or other there are all sorts of graphic images that move and animations and quite a lot of different things, all within 1 megabyte, which is quite amusing. So now, coming back to the cognitive, we studied a range of expertises because to begin with, I was very interested in how might somebody expert in electroacoustic music, but as you've already seen, not familiar with these particular pieces, how might their behavior differ from well-trained musicians and versus non-musicians. In fact, that hasn't turned out to be totally productive, and I won't go into it, because really what happens is that the variation between individuals is greater than the variation between the groups. We can discern both factors, but generally interpersonal variation is very substantial. So we're studying these 4 pieces in particular, but we've done a lot of work with Dvorak, with Mozart, with other pieces as well I won't go into. We measure the various acoustic properties of the piece, and we measure people's perception of change on the left-hand side. So as I said, we ask people to indicate whether or not they think the music is changing. If they think the music is changing, they are to scrub the mouse, and the more they think it's changing, the more they should scrub, and when they don't think it's changing, they should keep the mouse still. So we get a measure of movement which equates to their percept of the extent of change. And by doing that and not telling them what we mean by change, we find A, very coherent results, very coherent, and B, we take that as an index of their perception of things which go to make structure. Then we can do things like segment the pattern, statistically speaking, to identify structural units if we want, but we can also use it as a predictor variable in our analyses. And on the right-hand side, you have an illustration of a computer interface with the 2 dimensions representing arousal on the vertical and what we call valence, likability, on the horizontal. And we do this, being scientists, we do this also with the axes reversed, and we do a lot of stuff about the difference between people responding when they have 2 dimensions versus 1, which I won't go into. And the bottom line is, in the case of several pieces, notably the Trevor Wishart piece, that we can do an analysis which asks, we have a model of how the piece works in terms of the affective response, a mathematical model resulting from our data, and we know that there is an autoregressive property, which means that previous results influence the next one. So if you were aroused a second ago, if you perceived high arousal a second ago, you are likely to perceive reasonably high arousal next, and vice versa. I won't go into any of that, but the result is that you can put into the model, let me say that there was 1 unit change in intensity in relation to the range of intensity range this piece has. What will happen? And then we can say, what happens is that on the right-hand side, over the next 8 steps, which means actually about 5 seconds, you get a progressive increase in the perceived arousal. If you do the same thing for arousal itself, if you inject a 1 unit arousal jump into the piece model at this point, and then look what happens next, of course you get that auto-regression that I mentioned, a very big jump, and then it regresses. So this is the only way really that you can reliably analyze these continuous data, and you can get out these kind of inferences about the quantitative influence of different components, and it's based on the idea that the whole piece is described by a single model. But if you know the piece is segmented by a listener into chunks by the change parameter, you can analyze those separately if you want, of course. So I'm not going to go into that. But this was one example where we were able to go from the correlative to the causal. So we did this with Dvorak and with some completely unrelated pieces. And what we said was, well, if the intensity profile is driving perceived arousal so strongly as I've just said, then if we invert it frame by frame, we should be able to invert the arousal profile. So this is the result, the original arousal profile in blue, which shows larger dimension changes than the inverted intensity listening response, which is a mirror image and does have mathematical properties of a mirror image, but is, as you can see, in a sense, a narrower response. So we got a very good fulfillment of our prediction. We could do the kind of statistical analysis on it. And when we put the original intensity profile onto 4 completely unconnected pieces, they also showed a closely similar arousal response. So what's that saying is that in the case of these 5 pieces we studied, intensity was quite a major influence on people's perception of arousal. And I will say in passing that understanding valence in our hands and in everybody else's has been very much more difficult, and we don't have anything like as good models of that. Now let me just move on to another counter melody, This is in the mid-90s, a very interesting example, I think, produced by Chris Yavolo, an American. He produced a massive book called something like the Apple Computer Music Handbook. It's 400 pages, very thick IDG book. It's quite a classic, but he's also a very good composer and multimedia artist. And he, let me see if I've got his thing. This piece, Music is the Message, is available on the web. I actually downloaded it quite recently, and it's, or at least this video about it and including examples of it, and I'll just show you some little chunks. But the emphasis is here, we've got a video. Now, how do we think it's going to be interpreted emotionally, and can we influence that without changing the image by changing the sound? And it's quite a graphic demonstration which has had museum interactivity, people manipulating the emotion by their movement or by direct interaction with it. It's been displayed quite a few times. It really does give you the impression that it's true that your perception of the dangers, the possible murder and so on are completely transformed according to how the algorithmic music goes. So just let's have a little go. Where's the sound?
Film.
Right.
Click inside the red box around the graph to set up to 12 volume levels for your music. The closer your line is to the top of the box, press the button with the ear and you will be asked to rate. Bippity setting refers to...
It's nice if I can find a bit where there's...
And click on the little computer button.
The
Out of the red box to delete.
That gives you an idea of the sort of things he's talking about. The music is actually quite reductive. It's quite from the MIDI era, and it's quite pitch-based. There's only a limited timbral transformation, that sort of thing. But it's surprisingly effective. I can't spend enough time to give you the proper impression here, but I recommend having a look at it. It's very interesting, and I think the fundamental idea is right, that you can really use, in these intermediate contexts, the sound as quite a dominant influence, if you so wish. I wanted to just mention the reason that we studied this Trevor Wishart piece. It was, in fact, that it has, you may know it's quite a classic of electroacoustic music, in my opinion, Redbird. It has, in the section we chose, human sounds and vocal sounds which are clearly animate but not human. And so we chose that bit because we postulated that we would find the kinds of influence of acoustic intensity that I mentioned, but we thought that simple acoustic timbral properties like spectral flatness, spectral centroid, the sort of things that are measured by music information retrieval, would not be very powerful predictors, and that was probably a fair comment, and that there might be much more of an influence of specific timbral features like this. And indeed we showed that in a lot of different ways, so it was turned out to be quite a good choice from that point of view. I'll just show you a little bit of this. This is absolutely, have you actually experienced this, Steve?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I don't know if your book is mentioned here, but anyway, Steve's, you're not there, are you, Steve? No. Steve's book has a good section on it. And I think it's a very interesting piece where it's about immersion. You are physically within an environment in which you are a significant part of driving what happens sonically and otherwise. This may be the one. This is the one where I need to use fiancé. So you're in a completely dark environment, walking around. You have electronics attached to you normally. You can walk around without them. And you normally are experiencing this with goggles on and various other devices. It's been presented in a few different ways. It's often pretty dark. And then there's some wonderful landscapes. Sorry, we'll have to move on, but again, there's quite a lot of documentation available of that. I thoroughly recommend having a deep look at it. So now let me come to the kind of central topic, the kinds of methods that we can use. And I thought it's perhaps worth taking a step back before I run through the way I conceptualize it to say, what is it we're trying to achieve here? And do we have criteria? Should we have criteria? And when you talk about this field, you rapidly come face to face with the concepts of computational creativity, where the issue is, well, there is an intermediary here. There may be even an agent in the computer besides the person. And do we want it to pass tests of fitness for being a human product? And there's been quite a lot of emphasis, which I think is now overturned, on doing the so-called Turing test. And I personally support the current view that really that's not very useful, because we want computers and computer music, computer intermedia, to potentially go beyond what we could do as a human. I don't think we necessarily need to identify it as using a process which is presently within human processes. So I don't think a Turing test is the relevant thing. I think some of these ideas developed by Simon Colton, for example, in the UK, are probably more pertinent. The idea of being able to define a frame and looking at the utility within that, and the idea of looking at the relationship between how it's developed, how it's realized, and how it's appreciated. And I use the word obfuscation there because I think what one needs to do is make clear that we might be dealing with a conceptual field which is novel, and we might need to integrate it into our thought sets in the same way, probably, that we've integrated Western music and it now seems, in a sense, natural. It certainly wasn't. And as you know, there were huge arguments about things like tuning systems, modulation, equal temperament. It was far from natural. But it is kind of natural now. These things will be too. So I think Simon is on the right line, and probably Turing tests are a thing that aren't very useful here. I think the same is the conclusion you would come to from thinking about the implications of Mille Plateau, Deleuze and Guattari, and the idea of there being affective forces which are not identifiable with a person. And so probably useful is to think about having a pool of ideas that are going to be used in these processes, and to be thinking about selecting, generating, erasing, but also maintaining diversity. Now you can think in this way without necessarily thinking that we must have selection in a purely evolutionary sense. You could say we're going to have selection which deals only with the extremes. And one of the ways of ensuring that diversity is not lost during genetic algorithms, evolutionary processes in computation, life, is to actually make sure that one selects extremes rather than just fitness. But anyway, all of those ideas can contribute to a selective message, selective mechanism as part of the process. So again, turning to an example, this is a selective process going on in the computation of the score. It's another piece with a live score from 1995 by Greg, where the performers were playing the vibraphone with a MIDI attachment and MIDI keyboards, and they had to be improvising upon the notes on the screen at the time. And the assessment was made continuously by the computer of the precision with which various different aspects of the pattern on the screen were being realized. It might be the precision with which the notes played were all Ds, Fs, A flats, E flats and Cs, or it might be, and you didn't know as a performer which was being being judged except from the feedback along the left-hand side, which is indicating the computer's analysis. It might be more about contour. It might be more about harmonic implications, which are not simply the pitches, but their relationships. So it was very intriguing. You get the feedback. It gives you a changed kind of score when your changed notational score when your performance score gets too low. But it also is a question of trying to work out how it is that it's analyzing your stuff. So these are the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 categories of generative sound I wanted to mention briefly, and I think it may be useful to think about how to go about one's pieces with these kind of considerations in mind. I don't mean that this should drive them, that one should be impelled to make a piece with a mathematical formulation. I mean, it may be useful, if that's what you decide you want to do, to think about the context in which that has arisen and why it might be characteristic and different from the other approaches. So by a mathematical formation, I obviously mean that we have an equation of some form, which may or may not have any bearing on physical processes, and we're going to embody that equation in a musical piece. And the commonly used ones, live coding often has polynomial functions, particularly with my colleagues in Australia, the two Andrews, Brown and Sorensen. But it also has been used extensively in composition, and chaotic functions similarly. I just picked those at random out of what could be a list of 50. And you have to ask why. What are the assumptions? Commonly the assumption is, well, this is an interesting process, so it's bound to produce an interesting piece of music. That may be a dangerous assumption, I think, but if you take that in conjunction with, we will put some other kind of musical process on top of whatever parameters the mathematics are driving, then I think we may be in with a chance. And I think that can constitute a justification in that you are being forced to apply the separate musical controls that you normally use in your composing or improvising on top of a process which is disparate in relation to your other practice. And that can be stimulating and challenging. I think that is partially a justification. And yes, sometimes they work. I think this is always going to be a matter of opinion. And here I wanted to mention somebody whose work I have deep respect for. He died very, very young in 2002, and he made an incredible contribution to music cognition, but he was also a very, very good pianist, and he made this beautiful multicultural symphony, which is very sophisticated, and I mentioned it at this point in the talk just because it actually uses some quite elaborate mathematical processes in some of the sections. It's quite a MIDI and note-oriented piece, but I'll just give you a little taste of it. And I think it is very, very interesting. I do recommend it. Where are we? Sorry. So then we can turn to the idea of deriving an algorithm from information about composition, meaning we have a body of compositions. This has some relationship to Dimo's work on corpora and their use, but there are a lot of different approaches. We have a body of composition. We look at it from the point of view of what are features which might constitute styles. Perhaps we do that statistically, most probably we do, and we then use those statistical features to formulate patterns which we will use. And there's some pioneering work in this context from David Cope and his ME program. There have been specific stylistic regenerations, like by Ebsioglu, who developed a program for harmonizing Bach chorales in a fairly convincing way. So he already had a compositional framework, but then he used statistical methods to derive the accompaniment. And again, we can ask these same kind of questions. I think in the case of those two people, one of the questions which comes up beyond the ones I mentioned already is there any question of an issue of authenticity? Why would you want to make a Bach chorale generating compositional algorithm? Probably as an exercise in computational creativity and showing that it can achieve this output. I'm not so sure you would do it when you were primarily motivated by compositional drives per se. David Cope does have patents about creating new work. For example, he has one which calls itself something like retrograde recomposition, which is about the idea of constructing a new piece based on previous material but going backwards from the end. It's in the patent, it's not really expounded why that would be a desirable thing rather than going forwards. It seems to me it would come to the same conclusion, but put that aside, he was influenced by the idea of retrogrades in music. He is trying to make new stuff. So certainly when you think about John Oswald, resampling, all that tradition, you can see that in this light, that you might want to use a prior style and then play with it. But whether there are really justifications for recreating it for itself, I'm not so sure. They do work, I think, sometimes. They can be very, very interesting. I won't go into this one. I just had this one here as an example where, thanks to Mr. QuickTime Architect in 1997-8, we could also get audio files to go backwards and forwards on the web and have rather more multiplicity than seemed immediately likely with a small website. So moving right along, I've still got about 10 minutes, Per?
Yeah.
Yes? Moving right along. I think more interesting is the one which I actually used in my performance last night, this third approach, where you make an algorithm which represents the understanding of a particular compositional style. And I, last night, used serial composition techniques, but I used them on both a serial motive in the right-hand part of the electroacoustically driven piano, and I used it on a tonal motive in the left-hand part of the electroacoustically driven piano, and I used that tonal motive in my keyboard improvising with it. There was also some other sound transformation going on. And this is a case a bit like the one I mentioned before, where you might say, well, why bother to make a serial compositional driver anymore? That's 100 years old, we've done that. And my answer was, I actually found it very interesting, and I can make different kinds of music from it, which I've used in a lot of different contexts. For example, in multimedia pieces, short chunks. And it forces a different relationship between the, in that case, note-driven process of generation and the rest of your musical being. Of course, serial composition in the 60s and 70s didn't just operate on pitch, it operated on every other aspect of temporal features of music, and so you can use it for those, and I'm also beginning to do that. So I think there is mileage in this kind of approach, and that it could not only be well formulated prior compositional techniques, it can also be artificial ones that the composer chooses to make. I think a lot of the same questions I've alluded to already come up, but what I wanted to perhaps just mention specifically here is that once you have a formulation and you've set it up into some software algorithm that you can manipulate, of course you can also use that so that it evolves. For example, so that you perturb it, you loosen some of the parameters, you just take some of them out, you take some of the steps in the mechanism out, you add something completely extraneous, you immediately have an opportunity for a new development from it while retaining the core of the mechanism. And that's what I did, as I said, in this piece last night, where I had two separate hands worth of generation of electroacoustic piano, all of which I could control. Lots of parameters that I did use and lots of parameters that I didn't use, but I do use in some or other performance. And this is an example of an artificial grammar, a really simple one, where you say, I have entities, musical entities A to G, and the piece is going to start with A, and it can only progress probabilistically through the sequence of events that are allowed by the arrows, and the arrows would have probabilities attached to them. It's actually a little bit like the way that a linguistic conception of Chomsky and grammar sometimes operates, as our friend in the back row knows well. But it can be useful in musical composition too, and I've used it actually within a work recently done with Keith Armstrong. A little bit of the music has this as the controlling device. Also used it within this piece with Will Lewis. I don't think I'll show you that for reasons of time. So now we move towards the issue of statistical models of music, where you really take a whole body of music and you find statistical features of it which can describe it well. And then you say, well, can we use those statistical features as a generator? And I think probably there are some very simple examples of statistical features which are found in music, and I'll mention this temporal patterns of the acoustic intensity change in just a second. There are some deeper ones which involve the chains of events. And Geraint Wiggins and Marcus Pearce originated this concept, idiom, information dynamics of music, which is one particular approach to analysing music as an open dimension n-gram. N-gram meaning we have n successive events which are in a chain, and each particular n-gram has a certain probability. And if we hear, for example, the first two notes of an n-gram, we can then reduce the range of likelihoods of what the next 7, 8, 9, whatever it is according to the dimension of the model may be. So we can use it both as a descriptive tool and as a predictive one. And I see that as a kind of particular example of a Bayesian model, and you can generalize the approach beyond n-grams into entities which have not necessarily sequential but simultaneous relationship as well with Bayesian models. You can do things hierarchically. Then I've already mentioned time series analysis, which is a way of looking at the temporal structuring. And I think these allow one to focus both on all three levels, if you like, of musical operation: the micro, event by event; the meso, kind of phrase level; or the macro, the total piece. And it involves a lot of assumptions about the utility of the corpus. The corpus has to be assumed to be something whose stylistic features are ones that you are willing to use, obviously. There's certainly plenty of justifications. A lot of people are developing this kind of approach, and again, it can evolve. Now, just a really simple example of a statistical feature, we found in a whole series of papers that when you measure the duration of rises and falls in electroacoustic music, and then we've done it in a variety of other music, just coming out Haydn's string quartets, piano concertos and so on, we find that the rise time is short in comparison with the fall time. And you have to think about this in terms of the window of analysis. Are we interested in windows of 40 milliseconds, which are sort of like instrument attacks? No. Are we interested in windows of half a second, 5 seconds, 30 seconds, which might correspond to a phrase, a little structure, a mini piece? Yes. So you have to do your analysis in relation to a window, and in relation to a window across a piece, you get less and less chunks for a given length of piece. You know, if the piece is 60 minutes and your window is 30 minutes, you only get 2 chunks. So you have some limitations, but nevertheless the general message comes out that in each particular window, subject to those statistical limitations, the rise is quicker than the fall. And so I think this is probably explicable either because it's a feature of environmental sound, and we've only begun to assess that. If that's the case, then it would mean composers have intuitively developed a similar thing. It may also be explicable in terms of how attention is driven. So exciting events, the rise, the looming, their arousal and attention gathering, and vice versa, the decay of attention can be slower. So there's a kind of psychological questions which we follow on with. But I, as a composer, I immediately then short-circuit my loop of research creative practice and say, okay, I can make a piece based on this. And I do. I have pieces which have temporal patterns of intensity, like on the left-hand top there, where you can see that in nearly all the cases, the rise, in fact in all the cases, because it goes off the corner there, the rise time is shorter than the fall time. Those are axes of intensity and time. And you immediately come to questions. Well, you've shown this over 5 seconds, 10 seconds. What relevance does it have over long times? We don't know. We just put it in there and give it a try. This is purely aesthetic approach to how to make it. And then, is this going to work in spatialized music? Again, we don't have empirical data as to whether the same features are perceptible, but we are working on that. And you might have noticed last night, it might have been a bit hidden, but I was moving my sounds around in the piece with Demo all the time. It was continually repanning. That was part of what I find interesting about interactive stuff too. So I think I'm just going to move through that stuff about the time series analysis, so don't spend too long. Mention that one can, when you have a system like an idiom model of classical music, so we have statistical probabilities for chains of pitches in classical music, of course the same approach can be applied to any other kind of pitch system or any other kind of musical entity system. And so we developed some novel scales which don't have octaves, they don't have any recurring ratio intervals, for the purpose of using them in composition and in empirical work, because if this kind of statistical learning approach to how we understand and generate music is valid, it should work with them as well. And a lot of that stuff, as I said at the beginning, is going towards issues of computational creativity and towards the idea of generating cyborg kind of outputs which currently do not seem to be likely to have originated directly from individuals without computer mediation, and which might equally conceivably arise from a computer obviously programmed by humans but set loose. And in that context, neural nets are a very interesting example of computational devices which allow learning. The learning does not have to be pre-structured. The input has to have a representation, and that is clearly a form of knowledge built into what goes in and what is learnt. However, what comes out the other end doesn't even have to be structured in the same way necessarily. Normally it is. But the point is, you don't have to force a learning pattern. You don't have to tell the learning mechanism what is a right answer. You can if you want. But once you've got a system which produces output A from input Z as you desire, or as is common in the music being modeled, then you can come along and perturb it. And so you can not only generate the original style, but diversify from it. And this is very popular in the 1990s. There were a series of books and papers on it. Mike Moser was very big, for example. And it's somewhat dropped out, and the material for using neural nets within Max, for example, is rudimentary in comparison with the field in general. And so I think there's quite a lot of scope there. Michael Young has done some interesting stuff using neural nets within live Max performance. I think there's a lot more scope there, and we're trying to use it both, again, analytically and creatively. I think I said enough about that. So I think the idea of having a tool which is open, which doesn't require too much of a specification of what the output is, and then which is going to allow you manipulation and perturbation, is a bit like the thrill that you get in improvising with somebody else, that you don't know what they're going to do, that you have to respond, you have to decide whether your response is going to be one of indifference, cooperation, competition, however you want to conceptualize it. You have a choice, and that choice recurs. And you can see totally different stances towards that in some of the great improvisers like Derek Bailey, the late guitarist, for example. His stance always seemed to be, I'm going to do my own thing, and you are not going to be able to tell whether I even heard what you did. I don't know if you've experienced that with Evan, but it's not quite the same with Evan usually. So anyway, I think we can use computers towards that end. They can be our partners, they can be our enemies, they can be our collaborators. Very briefly, I wanted to flow through sonification and cognitive models and say, of course, representing data does require some kind of mapping between the data and the output, whether it's a visualization or a sonification. But beyond that, if you're careful about the transparency of that mapping, you can allow the structure of the data to drive the sound structure. So again, you have an access to potentially a different approach to how to make sound, because it's not driven by a musical concept, it's driven by some aspect of data in the real world, you know, whether it's earthquakes or whether it's the oil core. So that's a very interesting field where some good stuff is being done, and there are many people who would now call themselves data composers. A lot of interesting work there, I think, bears attention. And then less developed, but probably more important in the long run, is Well, if we have a decent model of how the brain as a whole works to do things like process sound, process image, process feeling, touch, haptic things, then why can't we use those models also as transducers within musical systems? And some of the large-scale models of the brain and the nervous system, like the one called ACT-R, ACT-R, developed by John Anderson, really are sufficiently in-depth that they can make predictions about kinds and speeds of responses to particular things. So they're quite advanced. And then if we use the body of those models, conceivably, I think we can find devices which will produce music, and because they're based on how the brain works, may be valuable ones. So that's looking quite towards the future. Very briefly, we're going to hear something more about live coding later on. And some people would like to make a strong distinction between a live algorithm, which is what I think I tend to use, and I think probably Demo mostly, where you have an algorithm existent, every aspect of which you can exploit and parametrically change, but often the body of which remains constant, even if you don't use it, versus live coding, where at the other extreme people would start with nothing and would generate the code on the fly, and every aspect of it would be mutable throughout. And I think it'll be interesting to hear what Rennick has to say, but to me he seems to be somewhere in the middle there, in a place which I find personally very appealing and practical, whereas I don't feel so much personal attraction to live coding per se. But the live coders would say reasonably, that's just because you're a lousy programmer. And that's fair comment, and I accept that. So I just want to wrap up now and say we've used a lot of these computational processes both with speech taken as sound and words taken as text and then as sources for sound. And this is a screen image from it's like a 3-screen piece of text, sound going on as well. It's all interactively driven. It's all written in Python, and it manipulates input text, generates transformed text image, transformed text, and has a video of text as well. Sometimes it's always rolling and developing readable stuff. So we're working further on this approach using computational, this is what I was talking about to you, computational approaches to linguistic analysis and then applying them. So I think I've said enough there. This is my most recent output record, if anybody's interested, which has a lot of these techniques used in a multi-piano performance I do. Grand piano, multi-channel sound, about 5 or 6 different musical strands going on at once at any time. Also has some older solo piano stuff of mine. Thank you very much. Those are the things I wanted to say. Want to take some questions, or?
Thank you very much, Roger. Yes, yes.